Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Trey Johnson, and welcome to our monthly lecture series, Museum After Hours. Tonight, we are joined by our very own Boone Dodson. Dodson is a proud Kansas native from Burlingame and has spent most of his life preserving American Civil War history in the form of living history events and reenacting. Ever since Boone's father introduced him to this form of history at the age of 4, he has been hooked. Through reenacting, Boone has gained a deep knowledge of American Civil War tactics and organization, as well as the experiences of private soldiers. Boone currently works here at the Kansas Historical Society, which offers him the opportunity to speak on topics he loves, just like he's about to do tonight. Dodson's talk, Dressed to the Colors, American Civil War Battle Flags, highlights the importance of flags on the American Civil War battlefield. Dodson explores the history of the flags and the significance to the soldiers carrying and fighting under them. Tonight, he will share flags from our collection at the Kansas Historical Society, many of which are in need of conservation. Dodson will highlight what has been and must still be done to preserve them for future generations to admire and remember the men who fought beneath their folds. After the presentation, we'll have some time for questions, so please use the chat or Q&A feature to type in those questions as they come to you. So let's all welcome Boone Dodson.
Hello, how is everybody tonight?
Hey,
Hope everybody's
Boone.
doing good.
Thanks so much for doing this.
Not a problem. It's my pleasure. Absolutely. All right, so let's go ahead and start off. You're going to be doing some screen sharing here. All right, so first off, I'd like to welcome everybody. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me ramble a little bit. Um, so so essentially with this speech, my goal here is to impress upon all of you the importance of the flags to the soldiers themselves, the ideas of how they were thought of and treated at the time, and also just to impress upon all of you that many of these flags, especially in a lot of collections today, are in need of dire help, and a lot of them are simply falling apart due to age and other factors that need to be taken into account. Um, so with that being said, let's go ahead and just dive right in. All right, so right off the bat on this first slide, the introduction, you're seeing a photo here. Now, this photo was taken at the 160th anniversary of Gettysburg this last June. And essentially, it's of a reenacting group that is portraying one of the regiments of the famous Iron Brigade that fought at Gettysburg and was very famous for their actions that they participated in there. Um, at the end of that battle, that brigade ceased to exist because of heavy casualties and some other factors also to take into consideration. But take a look at this formation. This is what's known as a line of battle. Um, two ranks deep, shoulder to shoulder. You see the two flags right just to the left a little bit, hard to miss. There is a regimental and a national standard. So two flags. And you'll notice right here, so you've got the regimental and then, of course, the national behind. There's reasonings for that I'll get into a little bit, but keep in mind this picture, okay, when we start getting into the next few slides, okay, if you would humor me. So next slide here is why were flags used in battle? So the first thing I have to keep in mind is you're going back with military tradition. It's Napoleonic tactics. Okay, so again, the era of Napoleon in Europe is where a lot of this comes from, but also it's flair, it's military tradition, military pride, um, and trying to keep the public interested as well, all that kind of things. It's very much a Victorian idea. So first thing you're seeing here is this illustration on the right that is from the U.S. Infantry Tactics Manual, authorized and adopted by Secretary of War Simon Cameron on May 1st, 1861. This is directly from that. And what you're seeing here is essentially it's a diagram trying to show the formation of a regiment. Now, a regiment was one of the most important unit sizes of the American Civil War. 1st Kansas Infantry, that's a regiment. Okay. Now, um, now a regiment will be made up of about 1,000 men, ideally. When you start getting into casualties and just casualties from diseases and casualties from battle, things like that, that number begins to dwindle. And so, depending upon what that regiment has experienced, could also affect their numbers. And even out here in the West, you'll often see these regiments being formed with smaller numbers than you would back east. So maybe like 1,000-man regiment back east versus here in Kansas, maybe 600, 800, somewhere around there. Um, Different examples of that. But here you'll see separations. Now, these lines right here are basically showing the separation of the regiment into companies. Okay. So a company is ideally about 100 men. Okay. So right here, you'll see the formation of a company, and each one of these little squares is supposed to represent a single infantryman, an enlisted man, a soldier. And then you'll see behind sergeants, lieutenants, positions of captains, and things like that. Um, so it's just kind of giving you an idea. And so this is all shoulder to shoulder. They are formed in shoulder to shoulder formations. Okay, so to add on to this, so used to identify and show locations of units at a distance. So flags were pretty designed to be pretty large in this circumstance. And that way, commanders of brigades, divisions, corps, and even armies would be able to see what specific regiment is at what specific location, even using like a spyglass or the binoculars. Um, Now, the flags could also be used as a rallying point. So let's say, for example, a regiment went into battle and they're taking casualties at a specific spot, and their line begins to break as the enemy is coming upon them very rapidly. If that line was to break, the commander of the regiment could take the colors, the color bearers, and have them placed in a specific position in the rear for the regiment to be able to form back up to. Um, so also used to dress the line of battle. So battle line of battle. If the regiment is moving around and trying to keep a formation, if it's advancing is the best example I can think of. The soldiers might start to drift from each other in line, and out of your peripheral as a soldier, you could see where the colors were, whether you were on the right wing, so the colors would be your left, or the left wing, the colors would be to your right. And you could see where you are in coordination with those colors to keep it in your peripheral. Um, all right, and then also again, part of the period's pageantry of war that is also going along with the Napoleonic tactics. Pageantry is a great example. These flags are very colorful, very beautiful, hand painted, all these little details that are involved. And just keep that in mind when you're looking at the flags and think, well, if this flag was brand new, what kind of a grand picture might this seem to be to civilians of the time? All right, and then another thing to consider is regimental and state pride. So these flags for a regiment specifically would often have the regiment's name hand painted onto it, as well as its battle honors. So the flags were a symbol of the regiment as a whole, and it would tell the other soldiers of the army or the enemy who you are, what unit you are, what battles you fought. Are you grizzled veterans or not? Those are the kind of things that you can kind of discern from a flag, for example. Now, whether an enlisted soldier would look for that kind of thing in the middle of a battle, that's a different story. But just keep that kind of thing in mind. Let's move on. Okay, so going from that last point, we're talking about the battle line, the line of battle. It is exactly how it sounds. They fought in this formation that what you're seeing here. So 2 ranks deep, front rank and a rear rank, and then every soldier is shoulder to shoulder. The idea was to focus as much firepower in a small area as possible, because you have to remember, even though rifling was becoming a big thing in the American Civil War, because it came into play with the American military in the widespread in the 1850s. It was around before that for a long time, but widespread for the average infantryman. You started seeing rifled weaponry in the 1850s. So they're still fighting shoulder to shoulder with tactics that were designed for smoothbore muskets, okay, and muskets that were designed to be loaded as a good soldier could load in about 3 rounds a minute with these. So the idea was, again, to focus as much firepower in a small amount of area as possible. So you can see here, we've got on this bottom right picture, you can see the flag, the national color, and every man, you can see a captain here, enlisted privates as well as corporals mixed in. And so these just pictures are really great because it's showing a whole regiment, or at least most of the regiments in question here. So on the top, we've got the 2nd Michigan Volunteer Infantry, which was taken shortly before First Manassas or First Bull Run. Now, the location of this picture is unknown. And then on the bottom right, we have the 110th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry Regiment. This photo was taken on April 24th of 1863 near Falmouth, Virginia. So in this picture on the bottom right, you're really seeing that this is a battle-worn regiment, okay? And this, if I remember correctly, when I was doing the research on this photo, it was taken shortly before Chancellorsville, where the 110th was took heavy casualties. So this is a photo that was taken before Chancellorsville when a lot of these soldiers never made it out. Something to keep in mind there. And we're moving on here. Just to give it another example, another formation that you might see on the Civil War battlefield. Now, this is something that troops would have been formed in like being held in reserve or other specific circumstances. But they would not have fought this way, at least not in the top left. Okay, so you might see a column of companies, which is what this is called. So each one of these lines of troops in here is a company. And they could easily form a battle line from like this formation, for example, by each company simply wheeling like a door. And there should be enough spacing in between each one to where each company could wheel and they would line up perfectly. At least that's how a well-trained regiment would be able to do. So on the top left, we've got the 96th Pennsylvania Volunteers, which was taken near Camp Northumberland, near Washington, D.C. And then we've got the 26th New York Volunteer Infantry, taken at Fort Lyon near Alexandria, Virginia, date taken unknown. But you'll see on the top left, it's a colorized photo, and I always really enjoyed it. It just puts a new level of perspective into it. So humor me, if you will, with this photograph. Now, this was another reenacting photo, so take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. But when you're looking at this photograph, you can see, for example, in the center here, a Union regiment formed in battle line, trying to give fire to Confederate troops in the distance. Now, if you were a commander on a hill, sitting back and seeing this picture right in front of you and battle unfolding, you would think, okay, well, how many troops are being held in reserve there? Well, one of the ways you can tell was by how many flags. So just to kind of give a decent example, so you're seeing this regiment here in the center being formed in line of battle. You can see the flag in the center. That's one single regiment. Then you've got another with a column of companies to the rear, another set of flags. And you've got also lots of cavalry moving around and a single artillery piece. It's some interesting things going on there. But that's one way a commander, like a division commander, could tell, okay, well, if the Confederates, for example, are going to be pushing this position really hard, how many reserve regiments do we have ready to fill a gap if a gap is formed from an attack? And that's just another way to think about it. We move on here. Okay, so we're going to start getting into the actual flags of the collection. So the first thing that we need to keep in mind is conservation challenges for these specific flags. Union Army flags, Federal Army flags of the time period were by regulation to be made of silk. And a regimental flag, an infantry regiment's flag was supposed to be 6 foot by 6 foot roughly, um, in dimensions. So they're large flags. Now with flags being that large, you have to come up with something that's a little bit more of a lighter material. Still kind of fits that bill, and it's has a beautiful shine to it in the distance and in sunlight. So it really made sense in a lot of ways for them in that time. However, today it's causing problems with conservation. So silk being the way it is, it's simply an unstable material. Okay, and that's due to some factors. So first thing that we need to take into account is silk is often a monofilament. So it's one single layer of material. Next thing to keep in mind is silk over long periods of time can be heavily damaged by light, of all things. So light damage essentially begins the breaking down of silk fibers, and that really starts the deterioration. And then little things can basically make the silk crumble after that if it's been exposed to enough. And silk simply just becomes brittle with age. Moisture leaves, and then a combination with light damage and things like that, it can really cause the flags to just simply crumble into powder, truly powder. Um, so next thing to keep in mind is the flags specifically here uh, were exposed to a lot of things because of their past storage and display. So pretty much almost all of the state of Kansas's battle flags from the American Civil War were put on display in the Topeka State Capitol building for a long period of time. We're talking like post-Civil War period up until 1914 when they were transferred with great fanfare, I might add, with lots of Civil War veterans and even Spanish American War veterans attending, but transferring the flags from the state capitol building to the memorial building where the Kansas Historical Society was. And they continued to be on display in the same way. But when they were on display at both the Capitol building and at the memorial building, they were all still displayed wrapped up on their original wood poles, same poles that were likely saw battle. Keep that in mind. Um, and because they were on display that way for such a long period of time, they were exposed to a lot of light and smoke from like cigars, for example. Cigarettes, we're talking 1880s, that kind of thing, even pipe tobacco, all kinds of contaminants for sure. And also because they were displayed on their original wood poles, it's wood. That wood's, with humidity, it's going to swell and contract. And since the flags were wrapped up around the poles, that can really add more stress to the flags as well. And then another thing to keep in mind is simply the weight of the fringe and the paint and the fabric. These flags are a lot heavier than you probably would ever think. Um, there's a lot of material to take into account. You've got a lot of fringe around the borders and the paint itself. And again, what you're going to see is that almost all of these flags have features on them that were hand painted and very beautifully, might I add. And then the next thing to take into account is battle damage. So you'll see some pictures after this of what I'm referring to, but a lot of these flags were absolutely carried into battle, and you'll see that from some pictures I'll be showing you here in a moment that they get tears, they get rips, and the pictures I have that you'll be seeing again, um, they're, I would say, more extreme examples, but examples nonetheless, original examples. So before I move on to those pictures, I want to look at this picture real quick. So you're seeing here, essentially, it's a picture of the same type of silk, okay, that is from a woman's dress that is at the National Museum of American History. So this picture itself is from an article, How Do You Preserve a 100-Year-Old Piece of Silk in Women's Suffrage History, again, by the National Museum of American History. And the whole point here is, again, this is the one picture on the top, picture on the bottom, and it's the same material. But the top, as you're looking at it, you'll notice is much more damaged, discolored. That's because the silk on the top, in the top picture, was silk that was taken it was a picture of silk that was on that dress that was exposed to the light. It was the top layer of silk, okay? Versus what we're seeing down below is the same silk material that was inside the dress, not exposed to lots of light, that kind of thing. So, and you can really see just the simple breakdown of the fibers and notice the density of the fibers, for example, in comparison. And that's if that's basically the whole idea is just to show what light can truly do to silk over a long period of time. All right, so moving on here, we've got a flag bearer with the national colors of the 8th Pennsylvania Reserves Infantry Regiment. Now, this is again a colorized photo, but very accurately colorized, might I add. But essentially, you're seeing here battle damage, and there's just and damage that could be done not just from battle, but also just simply the flags being used by the regiment on campaign, marching from location to location, going 20 miles a day in harsh conditions, being exposed to rain and sleet, depending on the year, the time of the year. Now, here on the right, we've got what I'm reading here. It's the colors of the 22nd Regiment after the charge on Chickasaw Bluffs near Vicksburg, Mississippi on December 29th, 1862. And this is right above that says Kentucky Infantry. So the 22nd Kentucky Infantry. So again, bit of extreme examples, but you can see just how much damage would be done to these flags from battle alone. So we're often very lucky to have these flags still around just because of these factors, let alone deterioration in age. All right, so moving on again. So we've got the color guard of the 23rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry Regiment. So this is kind of a rare thing when you see a pair of photographs from the same regiment. Now this would be the full color guard. So you got 8 men. You'd have the color sergeant carrying the national colors, and the next in line, color corporal, carrying the regimental colors. So again, color sergeant here, color corporal there, national colors, regimental colors. And so you're seeing that for each gentleman with the flag, there's 3 other gentlemen there. They were designated to be part of the color guard because they would be the next in line to grab the colors if the color bearer fell for in battle, whatever reason like that. They would also be there to guard the colors from anyone who might want to capture it. And in the Civil War period and going back to Napoleonic Wars, the American Revolution, going back that far, if a regiment's colors were captured in battle, it was a mark of great shame. And so all cares were taken to try to prevent that from happening, but nonetheless, in battle and other circumstances, it still happened, but not quite as often as you might see in previous periods in history. So moving on here. All right, so first flag I'm going to be covering belongs to the 7th Kansas Volunteer Cavalry, aka Jennison's Jayhawkers. And you really can't talk about the 7th Kansas Cav without talking about this gentleman right here, Jennison himself, Charles R. Jennison. So this man was a controversial character then, let alone today. Classic Jayhawker. Okay. He was participated heavily in bleeding Kansas as one of the Jayhawkers. And he was just simply a very interesting character. So the man was born on June 6th in 1834 in upstate New York. And he was a Republican and, depending on your definition of radical abolitionist. Now he moved his family to Osawatomie, Kansas in 1857, and then shortly after to Mound City. And he participated in Jayhawker raids on post-slavery communities all over Kansas and Missouri, and many labeled him as a vigilante. And the reason being for that, we do know that on at least 2 occasions he directly ordered the hangings of pro-slavery civilians. Now, in his defense, one of those hangings, from what I was reading, he basically captured a whole bunch of pro-slavery civilians, and he let all of them go except one man. This man was known to have gone into free areas, okay, free state areas, and capture African Americans, take back and be sold back into slavery to turn a profit. So he hanged this gentleman, and even officials of the time were sending troops to go after this man and couldn't find him. One of them was, for example, General Nathaniel Lyon, who was later killed at Wilson's Creek in 1861. All right, so another thing he was accused of doing was harassing a district court judge at Fort Scott for what he considered to be pro-slavery biased rulings. Now, again, um, controversial. So we'll go ahead and move on here with in October of 1861. Now he got permission from Governor Charles Robinson to raise the 7th Kansas Cavalry. And most of the initial volunteers were mostly all Jayhawkers that he had rode with at one time or another. Now, in his early service as commander of the 7th Kansas Cav, he was heavily criticized by Union General Henry Halleck, who was the commander of the Department of Missouri. He criticized him frequently for his raids on, again, pro-slavery Unionist Missouri communities. So he was also a bit causing some problems for the Federal Army and the Federal War Department by these actions. So in April of 1862, the 7th Kansas Cav received orders to go to New Mexico, and Jennison was then passed for promotion to brigadier general because of those previous circumstances. So this angered him so much that he resigned his commission. And as immediately after he resigned his commission, the 7th Kansas Cavalry orders were changed and instead were sent down the Corinth, Mississippi to take part in the actions there. So, well, after he resigned his commission, Jennison, he ended up leading Kansas militia units until the end of the war, but he was arrested several times for jayhawking and was finally dismissed on June 23rd, 1865. And he even went as far as to accuse the Lincoln government of pro-slavery bias more than once. So he was an interesting character, to say the least. Now, after he was out of the picture, the 7th Kansas Cav again was sent down to Corinth, Mississippi to take part of the actions there. And they participated in many engagements, mostly cavalry only engagements. But they participated in many saber charges, which is something you don't hear of very often in the Civil War period. But they fought hard, and they, after, in their later service, they also took part in fighting back against Confederate General Price's raid into Missouri and into Kansas. And they just had a good service record after Jennison had left. So let's move on here. We've got a few gentlemen here in this photo. Just put some faces and names to the regiment itself other than Jennison. We've got 4 gentlemen here. Private Curtis P. Casey of Company H, Private Dwight Chappell of Company F. We got Private Edgar Cove of Company H, and Sergeant George R. Ferris of Company H. And then we have First Lieutenant Merrihew of I can't read it there. First Lieutenant Russell W. Merrihew of Company E, and then First Lieutenant and Adjutant Frederick W. Emery. Now, adjutant was basically a staff position for the colonel of a regiment. So he would have been basically a glorified secretary, is the best way I can describe it, to the colonel of the regiment. Okay, moving on. Here's some claims to fame for the 7th Kansas Cav before I finally show you the first flag. Buffalo Bill Cody was mustered into the 7th Kansas Cavalry on February 24th of 1864 and was assigned to Company H. So the first flag I'm going to show you here was the guidon specifically for Company H of the 7th Kansas Cavalry. So that flag was done first because Buffalo Bill Cody was involved with them. It was a big reason. There's others that need to be done, but you got to keep in mind we have to think about priority with limited resources. So, according to Buffalo Bill Cody, he was one day after having been under the influence of bad whiskey, I woke to find myself a member of the 7th Kansas Cav. I do not remember how or when I enlisted. And I found that directly from his personal memoirs. So it's a really interesting little tidbit. And then we have a gentleman on the right here. This is General Philip Sheridan. Now, later in the war, about 1865, he had a major hand in Grant's plan to force Lee to surrender, and what inevitably ended in Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Well, his connection with the 7th Kansas Cav is when he was earlier in the war, the 7th Kansas Cav was put under his command once they were transferred to Corinth, Mississippi. So it's just a really neat tidbit there. And this photo of him is colorized. It's something you don't see very often. Very neat. I'm going to move on here. All right. So the first flag. So in this, I'm going to try to explain a little bit the process that is done to conserve these flags once we have them sent in. Okay. So it's a very expensive process, and it's a very tedious and very, what's the right word? Maybe anxious process for the people working on these. I mean, it's a irreplaceable piece of history, right? And if you were working on this flag and going through this process, you would want to be absolutely as careful as possible. Try to preserve as much as you can so future generations can see this artifact. All right, so the first process of this is documentation. This is basically the photos that this company called the Textile Preservation Associates Incorporated took for each step in their process of working on these flags. This is the picture of when they first received this flag from us and were able to roll it out on a table. So the first thing is fibers, fabrics, and threads are analyzed. So, and basically looking at every little stitch and detail and making sure, trying to keep everything as straight as possible, making sure everything is thoroughly documented. The original constructions of the flag and any alterations to the original construction are noted. And then scale drawings are made and an analysis report is prepared. And so I'll show you that scale drawings that are made in a moment. But first, we also got to keep in mind that this is one of my favorite parts of this process is particle samples are taken. Now, why is this my favorite? It's actually really fascinating. So if there was essentially, actually, I've got one of them here. It's particle sample. So you'll see that in this little baggie, you've got just a little disc here that literally, as it is, it's a particle sample. It's little particles from the flag that are stored in there. And then on top of that, if they find anything like burrs and things that are locked in the fabric for whatever reason, they take them out and put them in these little baggies. Now, this particle sample is from the 1st Kansas Infantry's flag, regimental flag. And the neat thing about this is that this is all the actual burrs that were taken out of the flag when this flag was worked on. It's really fascinating. Now, if for some reason there was any question at all to the originality, this is the true flag of the 7th Kansas. It's not if we want to make sure it's not a reproduction, anything like that. If there was any question, that particle sample could be sent into a lab and they can figure out, well, there's particles here from foliage and flowers from Georgia or Tennessee or Missouri, whatever it might be. And they can relate that to the story of the regiment itself. So let's say that the 8th Kansas Infantry was at Chickamauga, Georgia on so and so date and fought there, and we know they were in that part of the country. If their flag has particles from plants from that area, well, we know it's legit. It's one way to find out. Pretty neat. So okay, so again, looking at it, you can see all the loss of silk in the corners. Now, this is a guidon for a cavalry company. Okay, so Company H of the 7th Regiment, 7th Kansas Cavalry. And this is what's known as a swallowtail pattern. So you see two distinct tails. That's what you're seeing. So it's less fabric that catches in the wind so that it's easier for a soldier on horseback to be able to carry. And it's also a smaller flag. So keep that in mind when you see the pictures here. So this is just a scale drawings of when they first receive the flags in their lab. So they make these flags and they make these drawings, excuse me, and they note every little single original stitch and the construction, if there's any writing, details like that. And another sketch, for example, they make several depending on what they're looking at. So this one is basically showing, well, the rips and the losses of material, um, fading or staining, anything like that. And it's again to scale, so 1/4 size scale. But I just thought this was very fascinating when I first saw this. It's very neat. So I'm going to move on ahead here. All right. Next step of the process is stabilization. So stabilizing the material itself, keeping it from continuing to fall apart. Okay, conserving it. It's the whole goal. So this next step is essentially the first thing they had to do was vacuum clean the entire thing. So a very specialized type of vacuum is used, and they slowly, section by section, inch by inch, slowly vacuum the material, trying to get all airborne particles, loose soil, anything like that. And then the next step after that is they have to relax the material and remove the creases. So they actually use distilled water. Now you'd think, well, that'd be the last thing they wanted to use water. But to relax the material, there's got to be some kind of agent to be used. And distilled water is, again, very filtered water. There's pure water, no other contaminants whatsoever. So that is used and very gently sprayed on very small sections at a time. Okay. And once that is done, and as it's air drying, they place these little glass weights over those sections in order to flatten the material. And as it's drying, these weights are on it, and so it's making sure that the flag is going to dry as flat as possible. All right, and then okay, well, again, flag was left to dry, so let's go ahead and move on here. But you can see this is a picture that was taken after they began to get it wet and then slowly flatten it over time, so you can see like the little individual fibers of silk where there's losses of material, things like that. And we'll go ahead and move on here. All right, let me move this box over to the corner. Okay, and part of that process is another process called encapsulation. So encapsulation is the most important part of this process. Essentially, because of the weight of the flag itself, you can't allow the flag's weight to be stressing the flag itself. So the idea is, well, what can we do to take the weight of the flag off of itself? They came up, the solution is what's known as stable text. It's a mesh material, polycrepylene, if I remember correctly, that is very stable, non-acidic. And essentially what they do is they have these large cutouts to a little bit larger dimensions than the flag itself. And they lay one solid layer down and then lay the flag over and then lay another layer of the stable text over the flag. So you've got 3 layers, and then the center layer being the flag itself. And what they're doing is essentially they start stitching down the length of the flag. And if there's areas where there's missing material, they purposely stitch through there so they can avoid trying to make more holes in the material. The more holes, the more weaker the material gets. But this still has to be done so the material itself just simply doesn't disintegrate. So basically, again, doing little individual stitches with the stable text through the flag itself as carefully as possible, slowly as possible. And that is allowing the flag to be then raised and put on a panel. And I'll show you the panel here in a moment. Now, we're going to be talking again about just a little bit about, the process of the stable text material being applied. So, again, sewing through the fabric is avoided where possible, okay? Trying to keep as little of holes as possible, okay? And then stitches are purposely ran through areas where no fabric is present. Locations where this is not possible, undamaged areas. Stable text is secured by a vertical running stitch through all 3 layers, going all the way up. Again, trying to take the weight of the flag off of itself and onto the stable text material. And then loose fragments are aligned in the correct position. Now, if they receive a flag and then there's lots of little portions that have crumbled off, it kind of becomes a little bit of a puzzle for these textile workers at the lab. They have to figure out, okay, well, where's the proper location for this, using primary and secondary sources and photographs and everything they can to make sure that they do it right the first time. And then if the flag itself is put in a pressure mounted frame, then they don't need to sew the individual materials into the stable text. The frame itself holds them in place. And then the thread that's used is stable text thread of a matching color. And they'll often use different shades of stable text to try to blend in with the material of the flag itself, the color of the flag itself. So you'll kind of see that as we go along here. All right, so the next step is, once all of that is done, then you've got preparation for exhibition. So the next thing is a buffered acid-free panel is custom made for the flag itself. Okay, so you've got kind of a padded panel. Okay, now for the flags, they'd be just a bit thicker than this one I've got in my hands, but again, made of cotton and a few other very stable materials, non-acidic materials. And the flag is essentially sewn onto the panel through the stable text only across the top, okay? Securing it to the panel. So that way the panel is holding the stable text, okay? And the stable text is holding the weight and the flag itself, okay? So another thing to keep into mind is that when they put these flags onto the panels, they also put cotton fabric in specific locations to try to fill in the color of missing areas of the flag. Now, it's a little bit borderline restoration and not conservation, but I understand definitely why they do it. And they did it with this one specifically. So right where the canton is here, the blue stars section, they put a blue colored cotton fabric behind it and sewed it to the panel. That way, when they put the flag on, it filled in the color. Okay, try to restore at least the appearance of the flag itself. Okay. All right, moving on. Okay, next thing is a custom cut panel of ultraviolet filtering plexiglass is then laid over the flag. Okay, and then the flag and the panel and the plexiglass are all slowly and very carefully, I might add, inserted into a custom-made aluminum frame. And so that's what you're seeing here. You've got the large white aluminum frame bordering around the flag itself. And what this is doing is essentially creating the flag's own environment. Okay, cutting off the outside world and just keeping the environment with the flag stable. And then, of course, ultraviolet filtering plexiglass helps to protect from light damage, but it's still going to get it if you're not careful. And I'll get into that here in a moment. Now, this flag in of itself took 43 hours to complete. So, and this is a smaller flag, so keep that in mind. Lots of work, very, very slow. All right. So after all this work is done, and we get the flag back to the museum, what what are the requirements or even the recommendations of storing these flags, making sure that we try to preserve them as long as possible for the people of Kansas to be able to continue to see. All right, so it is recommended that flags such as this should be stored with less than 5 foot candles of light in order to avoid light damage. Now, it's really hard to show what 5 foot candles of light is, but I will tell you right now, it's fairly dim. Um, Now, this is, of course, if a flag is going on long-term display. Now, ideally, a flag should be rotated between exhibit and storage or covered with a dense cloth when not being viewed. Okay. All care should be taken to avoid aiming lights directly at the artifact, again, to prevent light damage and to prevent heat buildup within the frame that the flag is in. Um, and then lastly, they must be stored in a controlled temperature and humidity environment, so less than 70 degrees and roughly 45% humidity. Um, Again, these are all requirements and suggestions that are there in order to make sure that these artifacts stay around as long as possible. That's the whole goal here. Okay, so moving on, we're looking at Blair's second Kansas battery. So just one flag from them as well. Now, this is not a picture of the battery itself, but it is a picture of a Union battery in firing formation. So I love this picture because it really shows well all of the little things that are needed to make a battery of artillery work. And this is just 3 cannons that you're seeing here. And it looks, by the looks of them, they're 10-pounder Parrott rifles. But they each have their own caisson, okay, with several horses in the rear to be able to pull the gun around. And then even farther in the rear, you're seeing extra caissons that are there that have extra ammunition stowed in them. Uh, and then you'll notice just how many crew members are needed just to make one gun operational. It's a very neat picture. I'm going to move on here. So Blair's second Kansas battery. So they were put together on August 3rd of 1862. So essentially, General James Blunt, who was commander of the Kansas Department during the American Civil War, later on at least, he issued orders to a Major Charles White Blair, we have here on the left, and then on the right here we've got James Blunt. Two different pictures of him. Couldn't decide between the two because they were both so fancy. So he issued orders to Charles White Blair, who was a major in the 2nd Kansas Cavalry at the time, to organize another battery of light artillery, horse artillery. And at the time when these orders were issued, there were 2 12-pounder howitzers and 4 6-pounders that were currently available and not being used in Fort Scott. Okay, and best I could tell is that these were Confederate captured guns. And according to the sources, I found that was the case. So it was originally mustered in with 123 officers and men and was assigned to the 1st Brigade, 1st Division, Army of the Frontier, which General Blunt ended up commanding later on at Prairie Grove, Arkansas, for example, in 1860. And this would have been on December 7th, 1862. But they also, this battery specifically, because we're so far out here in the West and artillery was a bit of a hard thing to come by, the battery was often divided up into sections. So like a section of 2 guns where the battery was made up of 6 cannon, a section would be of 2. So one section would be commanded like by a lieutenant, for example, and they would be sent off with this command of cavalry to do this reconnaissance mission or moving to this fort or this position, whatever it might be. But several sections of this battery took part in Honey Springs, Oklahoma, along with the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, for example. Also took part in Cane Hill in Arkansas, Pea Ridge in Arkansas. They did see action in this very far Western theater. So move on here. Okay, so this is the condition that they received the flag. This is the regimental standard for the battery. And again, is 6 foot by 6 foot roughly. Okay. All right. So that last picture was when they first received it, still wrapped up on its original pole. And so this picture here is when you're seeing that they first got it unrolled. And so what are you seeing here? You're seeing lots of silk damage at the edge of the fly. So the whole thing being the fly itself. Um, Towards the very edge. And so keep in mind that when this flag was rolled up, okay, that's the part of the flag that would have been exposed to all the light and oil from people's fingers if they touched them, which again you have to keep in mind because safe practicing handling and excuse me safe handling practices. Thank you for your patience with me. Safe handling practices were not invented or excuse me used until the 1970s. Okay, in practical use. So, if this flag was being displayed at the Topeka Capitol building for a number of years and for some reason they had to be moved, they likely weren't wearing gloves, so they would have been probably touching the silk with their bare hands and things like that, which of course was also happened when they were originally being used in the 1860s. But time goes by, you want these things to last. We've learned a lot since then, and that's just something that has to be kept in mind, but you can really see where the damage is coming from. So again, flag was carefully rolled out. Then all the fibers and the fabrics, threads analyzed, original construction alterations are noted, scale drawings are made, analysis report was prepared, particle samples taken. So moving on here. Next picture, that this has been after it's been vacuum cleaned and distilled water mist was applied and dried and flattened under glass weight. So looking back at that last picture here, you can see all of this material as it's just been rolled out. You can see the rolling of the material, nothing's been flattened, and then we can go ahead and move on here and you can see everything has been flattened. Okay, so that's again from wetting the material with distilled water and flattening with glass weights. All right, so after that, stable text is applied to both sides and sandwiched together, same thing. So again, taking the weight of the flag off of itself. And then the ribbon ties. So this particular flag was designed to be tied to a flagpole in a different way than most of the others you see. So these have ties, specifically ties for that. And they actually had to encapsulate the stable text, excuse me, they actually had to encapsulate the ties themselves with stable text, like a little tube is essentially how they did it. So again, flag is then attached to a custom-made panel by sewing the stable text through the fringe at the top to the panel. So I'm going to move on here. So Acrosteel IGP5 plexiglass is laid over the flag to protect and apply light pressure. And then, of course, entire panel, flag, and glass were then inserted into a custom-made aluminum frame. This one took 99 hours to complete. Pretty extensive. But again, this is a large flag. I know the pictures simply don't do it justice. But also, what I neglected to mention is you're noticing at this one, please keep in mind that this is an artillery regimental flag, and according to the regulations of the time, artillery flags, regimental flags, were to be made in a gold yellowish color. So all the others you'll notice are going to be a bit different. All right, so last one of this one before we move on to the next. So just wanted to make a mention, this flag is a great example of battle honors being put onto the flag. You've got Newtonia, Missouri, which was on October 4th, 1862. So battle honors is when a specific unit had a successful action. They performed well, they did what they were ordered, they did their duty to the utmost. They were usually given permission to sew or paint on battle honors, so the names of those locations where those events took place. So on this one, you got Newtonia, Missouri, Sherwood, Missouri, Cabin Creek, Honey Springs, Cabin Creek and Honey Springs being in the Cherokee Nation. That's CN. And I specifically, every one of these battle honors that are listed out here, this is exactly how they were sewn on or painted onto the flag itself. So CN for Cherokee Nation in the date, of course. And so Fort Smith, Arkansas, Westport, Missouri, and then we go on. So you'll notice when you look at here, there's a ribbon across the top, and that's where they were put on. And so there's 3 on this side and then the other 3 on the other side. And again, all of this was hand painted, really, really beautiful, in my opinion. So moving on to the next one, we're looking at the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteer Infantry. This is something that, in my honest opinion, Kansans should absolutely be proud of. So everybody who's a Civil War nut or just simply interested in the Civil War has probably seen the movie Glory. Fantastic movie, really good job. I really enjoy it. It's a classic for me. However, they make it out that the 54th Massachusetts Infantry was the first African American regiment in the American Civil War. This is not true. It was the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteer Infantry. And we're going to go ahead and get just a little bit into the details of that, what's going on there. All right. Now, before I do that, I want to talk about this gentleman right here that you're seeing on the screen, okay? This gentleman's name is William Matthews. A very colorful character. He was a free man that grew up in Maryland and came to Leavenworth throughout later in life. And he ran a small hotel in Leavenworth and was very active in the Underground Railroad. And at the beginning of the war, when the war broke out of all the escaped slaves that he helped through the Underground Railroad, he had a lot of connections and had relocated many, so he knew where a lot of them were. And he formed together a whole company of about 100 or so guys and took them to Fort Leavenworth and offered them for service and were turned down. Now, keep that in mind when I start telling you about the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, okay? So, moving on here, we've got some pictures of some fine gentlemen. We've got over here on the left is James Henry Lane, got James Monroe Williams, James Kilpatrick Blunt, and again, William Matthews. So let's talk about James Henry Lane for a moment. Now, he was a prominent Kansas senator. Now, a lot of people will argue he's an abolitionist. A lot of people argue that he wasn't, and a lot of people argue that he was a opportunist. Hard to say, but he was certainly very influential. So essentially, he was given orders to raise more Kansas regiments in the spring of 1862. Now, this part's a little unclear. I haven't been able to get a solid answer for this part. Now, it's unclear whether he was directly ordered not to, or he just stretched his orders. But essentially, it could be claimed that against the wishes of the Federal War Department, he began efforts to raise an all-black regiment in August of 1862. And this occurred, and William Matthews, that same gentleman as I mentioned earlier, once James Henry Lane began raising the regiment, William Matthews showed up with those same men again and were accepted. And William Matthews here, he was essentially elected to be the the captain of the company that those men formed of the 1st Kansas Colored. So really, officially, unofficially, he was one of the very first African American officers in American history. So something really neat to think about there. So after they were first formed, about 5 months would pass before they were officially accepted into federal service. And in that time period, the 1st Kansas Colored was never paid. They fought, they marched, they moved, they did their duty, yet they were never paid. Now, when they were officially accepted into service was after the Emancipation Proclamation was finally going into sway. So the thing is that they fought at the Battle of Island Mound in Missouri. It wasn't a big fight by any means. It was more of a skirmish than anything. But essentially, a few companies, the First Kansas Colored, had entrenched themselves around in their camp, and Missouri guerrillas and some Confederate cavalry began attacking them over and over again, and it essentially ended in a Union victory. But this was big news. It was the first time that African American troops were really making national newspapers during the American Civil War. So it's a big thing. And I've read, I'm not going to make this argument myself, but I've read that some might argue that they could be an inspiration behind the Emancipation Proclamation. Hard to say. But the timing does fit. Now, all right. Where'd okay. So after the Battle of Island Mound, they were officially accepted into federal service on January 13th of 1863. Okay. Um, at Fort Scott here in Kansas. Now, they would go on to fight the battles of Cabin Creek in the Cherokee Nation, Honey Springs in the Cherokee Nation, Prairie du Anne, Sherwood, Jenkins Ferry, Camden, and Poison Springs. And all of these battle honors are actually on their flag, and you'll see that in a moment. But General Blunt here, who was a very strong abolitionist as well, he commanded them at Honey Springs in Oklahoma, the Cherokee Nation at the time. And he was quoted as saying, "The first Kansas particularly distinguished itself. They fought like veterans and preserved their line unbroken throughout the engagement." And they certainly did from the sources that I have read. Um, and then this gentleman here, second from the left, James Monroe Williams, he was the first Kansas Colored's first colonel, so their first initial commander. So, all right, we're moving on here. Okay, so this is the national flag of the first Kansas Colored. Okay. So again, this is the condition when it was received by Textile Preservation Associates Incorporated. And you're seeing that this is acidic-free paper that the flag has been placed over. Okay. And you looking at it, you can see little bits of powder and flakes that are coming off. That powder is just simply the silk material falling apart. And you'll see there's rips and tatters just from it being on the pole. So when we start moving on here, we've got the flag finally unrolled. So the flag is rolled and the staff is removed. Tacks removed, string and center pull sleeve and wrapped from nail, all that good stuff. So, and then the original construction on alterations are noted, all that good stuff. So, and then vacuum cleaned, humidified, distilled water mist, fragments realigned to original locations, flattened and dried under glass weights were placed on the flag. Flag was then partially encapsulated with stable text. A crew stable text is applied to the reverse and reverse of the fly. Canton was backed by a crew stable text, the reverse slide only, and the flag was then attached to a panel. And same go around, you're looking at 105.5 hours. So something to keep in mind there. It's just a lot of time taken. Last one I'll show, and then we can go ahead and wrap this up. This was the regimental flag of the first Kansas Colored. This one, pre-warning, will be a little bit painful to see this next photo. So looking at this one, again, carefully unrolled, staff's carefully removed, analysis report and drawing, samples taken, all that good stuff. But you'll see this is all of the damage from it being stowed away and could very well, some of it be battle damage. So just the last ones I'm showing here. Humidified, fragments realigned, so and you can see the stable text here and the border of it, and it's basically taking up the space of what the flag's size originally would have been. So it's trying to represent that. Okay. And it's basically about 15% of the flag was missing when it was sent in. So and here in this last picture you're seeing is in this particular one, the missing areas, they used again the material sewed onto the padded panel to try to fill in the gaps of the flag itself, just to kind of restore the appearance of the flag, but not the flag itself. And this one took 121 hours to complete. So going ahead and beginning to wrap up really quickly, I would just like to say that thank you all for listening to me ramble for a little bit. Um, and I would like to say this last thing. There is 63 of these types of battle flags in the collection from Civil War and the Spanish American War in this collection. And most of the Civil War ones, because they were displayed in such a way, they still very much need help, and they all have to be sent in to do this. We just took one of the flags out of one of the other flags that hadn't been worked on out of the tubes, and it was about an estimate of about $28,000 to have it done and framed and all of that. And this fund is donation only for these flags, the Save the Flag Fund. So if you're interested, please feel free. If not, spread some awareness. Let's try to get some kind of income just so we can save these priceless, irreplaceable pieces of American history, and specifically Kansas history. Thank you all.
Well, thank you, Boone, so much. And I guess just coming right off of that, if everyone would give me a brief moment here, I will make it as easy as possible. If you would like to throw some money into that fund, I will post a link directly to our museum stores page that handles uh, all of those donations. All right, there we go. So, Boone, did any of the flags that we saw in your presentation, were any of those on display in the old Kansas Museum of History gallery before they closed down?
Yes, in fact, I believe all of them you saw have been on display at one point or another. Now, I know the guidon for the 7th Kansas Cavalry's Company H was on display for a long period of time around um, the Lawrence sacking of Lawrence display that was in there in the old gallery, and then Blair's Second Kansas Battery flag, the First Kansas Coloreds regimental and their national were rotated quite a bit years ago. That practice was slowed down a bit just because, quite frankly, these flags in their aluminum frames are very heavy. They are very hard to move, but it is again what must be done. So they were rotated out quite frequently in years past. It slowed down a bit, but again, we're hoping that some of these can go back out again. So
Oh, well, perfect. So Dan here says, Boone, thanks so much for your presentation. The 8th Kansas Infantry brought 3 flags home to Kansas according to their regimental history. I've seen the beautiful preserved one that's been displayed. That was their 3rd flag. Do you know if the other 2 are still surviving?
so basically, I have found 4 in the collection. And not to mention another one that's tied with them, but not super directly. Okay. I'll explain that as briefly as I can. But there's 2 national flags and 2 regimental flags. One has been done so far, and we believe it to be the one that they received after their reenlistment as veteran volunteers in 1864. That's the one that has been done so far. That's the regimental flag. The other regimental flag we actually just pulled out of the tubes recently, and I was planning on showing more of this. I just went a little longer than I wanted to. So I can show just pictures of it briefly. Oh, not escaping. Well, darn. Well, long story short is I did take a couple of pictures of it. Now, we took the other regimental flag that we believe to be the one that the 8th Kansas carried into battle at Chickamauga, Missionary Ridge, and Perryville, and it was actually in a lot better condition than we ever expected. However, because of the nature of these flags and their age and their brittleness, we were not able to unroll it. That will have to be done by the lab themselves. And so essentially, we hope to have that going here soon, but everything takes time, and it's a very long and tedious process.
We had someone else ask, the fringe seems to be fairly well preserved. What was it made of? On the artillery flag, was it typical to have the commander's name on it?
So The funny thing about a lot of regiments that were raised at the beginning of the American Civil War was the initial commander of that regiment or battery was, or even just the man who raised the specific unit itself would often be would often be tied in with what would become the nickname of that unit. So Blair's Battery, Second Kansas Battery. Okay. Um, and a lot of militia units, for example, had the same kind of thing. Um, Now, what was the second part of that question? I apologize.
Um, what was the fringe made out of?
Yes, thank you. So the fringe was usually made of a gold kind of fringe. Now, the exact material, unfortunately, I cannot say specifically. I know that actual gold, oftentimes was actually mixed in with the material itself, but the name of it escapes me. I wish I could say.
No, no worries. Um, so earlier on, you had kind of talked about the members of like the color guard. If one falls in battle, the other one would pick it up. What would happen if every member of the color guard fell in battle? Would someone just take up that responsibility?
Well, I would say that that'd be a very desperate situation indeed. If all members of the color guard were to fall, the next man closest to it, according to tradition, would see it fall and nobody's picking it up. The next man that would be available would just simply have to grab it and get it off the ground as quickly as possible. Again, cannot stress the importance of these flags enough, not just in their morale and their mind, but in battle itself. They had, where that flag was, the soldiers followed. You know, that flag had to be up. And so if all the members of the color guard fell for whatever reason, whether in a desperate struggle, one man would surely have to pick that thing up. It's just simply part of it. The reverence is what I'm trying to emphasize here. So,
I mean, due to how important these were, I mean, were they targeted themselves by the opposing side? I mean, uh,
oh, I do not doubt that at all. It's specific circumstances. I mean, if you were a Confederate soldier, facing off against Federal infantry in Chickamauga or Wilson's Creek, whatever, well, not Wilson's Creek, but later on, um, would you be aiming specifically for the color bearers? With the importance of those flags, I'm sure a Confederate soldier who fought by the same system would have understood that. Um, and he probably would have aimed for it. But I've also read many times from primary sources that these soldiers often would just purposely miss sometimes or purposely wound instead of try to purposely kill. I mean, it's speculation, but things to think about. You know, it's hard to say, but I have no doubt that in a lot of circumstances, absolutely, soldiers would have shot for color bearer. And I think that the higher mortality rate for color bearers certainly speaks to that.
all right. Well, I think that we just about wraps up how much time we have this evening. So thank you, Boone, again for doing this. I personally learned a lot, and I'm sure our viewers did too. Um, and I hope everyone here can join us again next month. We have a kind of once in a lifetime opportunity here. So Wednesday, January 10th at 6:30. You will be able to hear from a World War II survivor, Mildred Schindler Jansen, in her program, Surviving Hitler, Evading Stalin. So be sure to tune into that. And from everyone here at Museum After Hours, thank you so much for